lecture series for ethics. In this video, we'll begin discussing the final figure that we will talk about in this course, the German 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant. And in order to put his views in the proper context, in order to understand how Kant's moral theory forms really a strong contrast with the consequentialist and utilitarian theory that we saw in John Stuart Mill, in order to understand all that, I want to introduce his ideas by using one specific historical example, which I think can help us understand the basic sort of fundamental point of Kant's moral system. And that historical example is the decision made at the end of World War II to use the atomic bomb against Japan. Right, so near the end of World War II in the Pacific Front, Truman, the president at the time, had the following decision. We could engage in a land invasion of Japan in order to attempt to end the war, or we could use the new technology that was developed in the atomic bomb. Now, all of the actual decision-making itself, right, has been under some historical dispute, right? The idea at the time was that, well, if we do a land invasion, then X number of lives will be lost total, and that will be less than the total number of lives that would be lost through the atomic bomb. Okay, and so you can dispute whether that is actually the case, and people still sort of debate that to this day. And there are, of course, some relatively straightforward ways that you can think of to criticize that view. You might say, well, if we really wanted to bring Japan to the bargaining table, why don't we first just do a show of strength, use the atomic bomb in the ocean in some way to show Japan we were serious before actually using it on civilians? That's a debate you can have, right? But for our purposes, I want to think about just that first justification. Right? I want to think about the idea of using a sort of consequentialist or utilitarian sort of reasoning to justify using the atomic bomb. So you say, look, if we engage in a land invasion, more lives will be lost, less lives will be lost if we use the atomic bomb. Therefore, we ought to use the atomic bomb. It seems like a straightforward sort of utilitarian justification. And famously, Truman said after he made the decision, he said that he slept like a baby after signing the order to use those bombs. So one thing we might wonder about is, should Truman's conscience have been so clear? Even if we accept the calculation that more lives will be saved, even if we assume for the sake of argument that's true, is that a sufficient justification to warrant the use of atomic bombs against innocent civilians? And notice in this quote I have here as well, Truman wrote in his diary, "I've told the Secretary of War, Mr. Stimson, to use it so that military objectives and soldiers and sailors are the target and not women and children. The target will be a purely military one." Now, it's hard entirely to know what Truman could mean here. Of course, dropping an atomic bomb on a city of innocent civilians means that the civilians themselves are going to be a direct target of that action. And in fact, this seems like exactly the sort of action that the doctrine of double effect, for instance, would say is not permissible. It's not permissible to take the life of an innocent human being, an enemy non-combatant in this case, even if the greater outcome is a good one, which would be ending the war. So, but what I want to think about here is, even if the doctrine of double effect would not agree with this decision, can we just use utilitarian reasoning? Can we just use the consequentialist reasoning and say, look, add up the lives saved, the lives lost. If dropping the bomb saves the most lives, even if we have to take the lives of innocent civilians to do so, then that's the right thing to do. And if you're a utilitarian, again, you can, in principle, make that argument. But what's interesting is, after this decision, in the aftermath of it, there was a philosopher named Elizabeth Anscombe who was heavily critical of this decision and said, look, regardless of how many lives it would save, even if it were true, even if it is true that dropping the atomic bomb would save more lives, even if that's the case, it is still the wrong thing to do. And the way she expressed this idea is in the following very sort of pungent and pithy statement. She says, if you had to choose between boiling one baby and letting some frightful disaster befall 1,000 people, or 1,000,000 people if 1,000 is not enough, what would you do? And the way she poses that question is apt and it's relevant here because, of course, when the atomic bomb was dropped on these innocent civilians, people literally were boiled to death in the aftermath of that action. And the point that Anscombe is making here is that there are some actions that are so bad, that are so horrendous, that are so morally corrupt, that they can't be justified no matter how many lives would ultimately save by doing them. In this case, she's saying, look, no matter how many lives you could save, 1,000, 1,000,000, I don't think it would matter for her. There's something about boiling an innocent baby alive that is so horrible, so frightfully and dreadfully morally evil and corrupt that it simply cannot be done. Now, this idea that Anscombe is expressing is what we're going to see is known as moral absolutism. It's this idea that there are certain moral rules, certain moral principles, certain moral prohibitions that are so important, there's some actions that are completely wrong in themselves that they can never be done under any circumstances. And depending on, what moral absolutists we're talking about, different philosophers might identify different things as being moral absolutes. So the first things you might go to would be something like, don't kill another innocent person. Maybe you think theft is a moral absolute. Maybe you even think lying is a moral absolute. But regardless of what you think are the absolutes, the perspective of moral absolutism says that for those actions which are morally bad and corrupt in themselves, no calculation of the consequences can ever justify them. No matter how many lives you could possibly save by boiling one innocent baby, it would never be acceptable to do that. Now, I bring all of this up specifically because it's a nice introduction to the moral perspective that we're going to see in Immanuel Kant. Because Kant was an absolutist, and he was a quite extreme form of absolutist, such that he thought for a moral rule to even qualify as a moral rule, it had to be an absolute rule, something we were never allowed to break under any circumstances, no matter how good the consequences would be of doing so. No matter what the benefit of lying, no matter what the benefit of murder or theft or any other sort of moral absolutes he identified, no matter what the benefit is, we are simply, from a moral point of view, never allowed to perform those actions. And so we can see how this is very much a contrast to the utilitarianism and consequentialism of John Stuart Mill, who said, well, when we're thinking about right and wrong, we're always thinking about the consequences. And instead, Kant takes what we're going to refer to as a deontological approach. So what is deontology? So it's based on this Greek root word deon, which means obligation or duty. And in general, it's just an approach to ethics that emphasizes following the rules and performing one's duty. Whereas the utilitarians say, try to do as much good as you can in the world, produce as much happiness as you can. If that means following traditional moral rules, then great. If it means breaking traditional moral rules, then that's fine too. All that really matters is that we're producing as much happiness as we can in the world. But for Kant, matters are different. What's primarily important is not calculating the consequences of our actions, but asking ourselves, are these the sorts of actions that in and of themselves should be performed or not? Now, and to explain this approach a little further, I want to break it down into two different components which really characterize Kant's thought. So on the one hand, deontology is associated with absolutism, which, as I've said, is just this idea that there's certain moral rules that can never be broken. And in this video and the next two videos that follow, we're really going to focus on this moral absolutist aspect of Kant's thought and ask the question, how is it possible to have moral absolutes? How is it possible to have moral absolutes in a world that is constantly changing, where circumstances are always in flux, and it seems that different situations call for different behavior? So we're going to look at the absolutist aspect of his theory first. But also associated with his deontological point of view is this idea of respect for persons. Another part of Kant's view is that there is something so important about human beings, because we have the ability to reason, because we have a will, that gives human beings a special status. And this special status implies that we must be treated with respect. And that is going to imply a whole host of moral duties. And so we're going to look at his ideas about respect for persons in the next videos after the set on absolutism. But in general, this gives you a framework. Kant is a moral absolutist, and he also thinks a foundational ethical principle is that we must show respect for other persons and also our own person. So, as I was saying, the first question we really need to think about is, how is a moral absolutist ethics possible? How can it be possible to say something must always be done or never be done when it seems there's always some situation that could demand it? Isn't there always some situation that would demand that we take another person's life, even if it's a very rare circumstance? Isn't there some situation where we have to lie? Isn't the cost of not telling a lie simply too high? So how can Kant say there are moral absolutes? In order to understand his point here, we need to really think about what sort of science or what sort of discipline ethics is in Kant's view. And to see this, we're going to begin by looking at the preface to his famous Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. So what he starts to do there is he tells us that, classically in ancient Greek philosophy, they divided all the sciences into three kinds: physics, ethics, and logic. Now, at first, this might seem rather strange to us because in our modern academic system, we're used to there being many disciplines. There's all the social sciences, there's the hard sciences, there's engineering, there's psychology, there's the arts, right? So how can you divide them into three, right? Well, they're meant to be very broad categories, and if you think about it for a moment, it does sort of make sense that these would be the three categories you would identify. Physics would be the study of the physical world, whether the physical world is something like chemistry, or whether it is something like engineering, or even psychology, which is studying the human mind. Then there's logic. There's a study of how to reason correctly, which you could also probably put mathematics in, a more formal study. And then there's ethics, right? There's a study of the physical world, there's a study of how to reason, and then there's a study of how we should act. So these do seem like three broadly acceptable categories. And the point Kant wants to make here is he wants to distinguish or make clear what is different about ethics and what makes it different from the study of physics, of studying the physical world in all its shapes, and studying logic. And he does so in the following passage, where he refers to all the various types of rational cognition. So what does he mean by rational cognition? He just basically means any sort of science or any study that's aimed toward finding out some truth. So any academic discipline would qualify as what he means by rational cognition. And his point is that every single discipline, every science is meant to discover some sort of laws. And to see this, we can look at how he breaks this division down. So he says, first of all, the sciences are all forms of rational cognition. Some are formal and some are material. And what that just means is the formal ones are very abstract, whereas the material ones have to do with what you might say is the real world or the practical world or the world we live in. And of the three, only one of these is formal. Logic is the formal one. And what universal laws does it give us? The laws of inference. That just means the laws of good reasoning, right? So if you think back to the very first week of this course, where I had a very brief lesson on some basics of logic, premises and conclusions, and how premises lead to the conclusion, how we can infer a conclusion from premises, that was a study of logic. And notice when we're studying logic, we're really just studying the form or structure of arguments. We're not even studying anything particular about the content of those arguments. And so this is why logic is a formal discipline, and because we're thinking about ethics, is just not going to be super relevant for what Kant wants to say. But logic, because it is a science, does discover some universal laws, and those are just the laws of inference or laws of good reason. But what's more important are the material forms of rational cognition. And the material forms are physics and ethics. So let's start with physics. Broadly speaking, what Kant says is that physics gives us laws of nature. And there could be many different kinds of laws of nature. There could be, the ones that are studied by people we call physicists today, like gravitational constants or the rate of expansion and contraction, all those sorts of things. It can also be psychological laws, the things that psychologists study. It could be economic laws, the things that economists study, right? So any sort of discipline which is studying the physical world and trying to figure out and explain behavior or explain how things move in the world, that is aimed at discovering these laws of nature. Now, the primary thing to understand about the laws of nature is that the things that follow these laws lack any choice or freedom. So let's just take one easy example here, because the psychological laws or economical or economic laws, those are a little more difficult to understand. But let's take the easiest example. Let's say you have a billiard ball and you hit it with a pool cue, and you do some fancy calculations based on the speed of the pool cue and the angle that the ball is going to hit off the side of the pool table. All those things, you do some calculations, and you can see its velocity and where it's going to end up. Right? Now, in that whole procedure, the pool ball and the cue and everything had no choice in the matter. They were just following physical laws. And anything that these laws of physics, these laws of nature applies to, is always something without choice. As Kant is going to say, it's always something without a will. So trees and rocks and cars and houses and computers, all these things just follow laws of nature without any real choice. And that's really what characterizes the study of physics and it's the laws of nature it produces. But as you can see here, this is very different from ethics. Ethics, just like logic, just like physics, gives us some laws. But what are these laws? He calls them the laws of freedom. Whereas physics examines and produces laws that are followed by objects without freedom, ethics produces or discovers laws that are followed by entities with freedom, with choice, with a will. And this phrase, a law of freedom, at first should give you some pause, because you might think that's very odd, because law and freedom don't typically tend to go together. When I think about a law, I generally think about a restraint on my freedom. I think about something holding me back from what I want to do, right? It's a restriction. So how in the world could there be a law of freedom? Well, so think about it this way. And the first thing you think about with laws is probably legal laws, and there definitely is a comparison there. But first, just think about like rules in your daily life. So that you probably have some rules that you follow that, you institute on yourself to help you succeed in life or to help you achieve your goals. So for instance, you might have a rule that, when your alarm clock goes off, you're only going to snooze it once. Maybe you're trying to get in shape, so you say, I have a rule, I'm going to make sure I work out 4 days a week. You might be trying to eat healthier, so you say, well, when I get off the bus, instead of taking the route that goes right by the bakery, which tempts me to go in and get a very sweet treat and eat it on the way home, my rule is I'm going to take the route around the bakery that doesn't cause me to go by it. Maybe you have a rule to yourself that when you get in an argument with your spouse or you feel angry toward a significant other or a friend, maybe you have a rule that says to yourself, before I respond, I'm going to take 10 seconds, calm myself down, and think about what I want to say. These are all rules that we have, that we institute on ourselves in order to make us more successful, more flourishing, and cause us to avoid difficulties. And one thing you might also say about these rules is that they make us more free than we would be otherwise. And again, you might say, well, how am I more free? I mean, if I was truly free, I would have the freedom to break the rule and become angry at the people I love, or the freedom to not eat properly and exercise, the freedom to just sleep in. But what sort of freedom is that? And one thing you might ask yourself is, if you didn't have these rules, then what would be controlling you? What many philosophers would say is that at that point, what's controlling you is not yourself, but your passions, your emotions, your immediate desires, your immediate desire to want to sleep in, your immediate desire to want to eat sweet treats or avoid your workouts, your immediate desire to become angry and resentful at those that you perceive as wronging you, even though you know you might be overreacting or the situation doesn't call for it. The point is that you can either be controlled by one of two things: the rules you institute on yourself, which you institute on yourself for your own good and for your own well-being, or you can be controlled by your passions and your emotions and your instincts and your immediate inclinations. Another way of putting it, which I think who Kant would find very important, you can either be controlled by your human reason or your animal instincts. And for Kant, the only way that you can be truly free as a human being is to follow certain rules that free you from being a slave to your passions, a slave to your emotions, a slave to your desires and instincts. And what Kant is talking about here is not, in this context, is not primarily the sort of rules for self-help I was describing, although those aren't exactly unrelated. What he's really talking about are ethical and moral rules. The reason Kant thinks that ethics describes the laws of freedom is because, paradoxically, he says, if you are a good moral person, if you follow these absolute moral rules, don't lie, don't steal, don't kill, don't defraud other people, don't make false promises, if you follow those rules, they're not going to be restrictions on your freedom, they're going to be the fulfillment of your freedom. It's the only way you can truly be free. So whereas physics discovers the laws of nature that govern physical bodies and things that are not free, ethics discovers the laws of freedom, the very laws and rules and restrictions that actually increase our freedom. And we can also see Kant describe this point in another way, namely the difference between physics and ethics, the difference between the laws of nature and the laws of freedom. He tells us the laws of nature give us an answer to the question, how does everything happen? At what speed do falling objects fall toward the earth? At what speed will the billiard ball shoot off the wall? What is the tendency of human beings to be able to resist peer pressure? All of the laws of nature, of their various types, tell us how do things actually happen. What do the laws of freedom tell us? They don't necessarily tell us how things do happen. Of course, people act unethically, they act immorally, and that happens all the time. And there's even parts of our psychology which make it more likely that we'll do what we know is wrong. But what the laws of freedom tell us is how everything should happen, how we ought to act. And so the idea is that if you act as you should, if you act in a way that is proper and moral and upright, then you will be following these laws that make you more free. But to say that something is a law of freedom doesn't mean it actually happens often or even most of the time. For instance, Kant is going to say that there's an absolute moral prohibition against lying, but Kant would be the first to admit that, of course, people lie all the time. So it's not, when we say that you should not lie, that it's never okay to lie, we're not saying that's a law of nature. People lie all the time. We're saying it's a law of freedom. We're saying to the extent that those people who do not lie, the extent to which they don't tell lies, that is the extent to which they're controlling their passions, controlling their animal instincts, using their reason, and truly becoming free. Now, there's one other point to make here, which I've only suggested at. We've said that the laws of nature control those things which are not free. And every law seems like it should be governing something. So what is it that the laws of freedom are governing? Well, the best way to think about this is that the laws of freedom are governing our will. And as one commentator on Kant explains, our will is the ability to form intentions to act. So anytime you form some intention to undergo some action, for instance, I'm going to watch this video to learn about Kant, or I'm going to make a salad for lunch, or I'm going to tell a lie, or I'm going to steal from someone. Whenever you're forming an intention to act, you're exercising your will. And so when we say that the laws of nature only govern things that don't have freedom, don't have a will, think about a rock. A rock just acts as it's acted upon. It's not even really appropriate to say a rock acts, because it doesn't use reason, it doesn't exercise choice. So wherever a will is found, and for Kant a will is found in any being that can reason, then there will be a certain set of laws of freedom that ought to govern that will. There will be a certain set called the laws of freedom, which, if that will acts in accordance with those laws, then you will have a free will. And to the extent that it doesn't act in accordance with those laws, then you have a will that is not free, that is constrained, that is a slave to your passions. And now that we have seen these points about the laws of nature and the laws of freedom, we can see that the human being is actually in a very unique place. Because let's start with this question. Let's think about what are some things that are only governed by the laws of nature. I've given you examples: rocks and trees, computers and cars and houses, right? All just merely physical objects without a will. Those are only governed by the laws of nature. What about the laws of freedom? Can we think of anything that would only be governed by the laws of freedom, that would not at all be subject to physical laws of nature? Well, it'd have to be something like God, for instance. If such a being exists, then that being would have to be a sort of being that's ultimately and utterly and completely free and independent of any physical influence. It would have to be a being that always does everything perfectly, and to that extent is only governed by the laws of freedom. This is an idea that you often see with the idea that God or the divine being is totally independent and depends on nothing outside of itself. So on the one hand, you have like God that is only governed by the laws of freedom. You have rocks and trees that are only governed by the laws of nature. And then you have the human being. And the question is, well, what is the human being governed by? Well, if Kant's right, we are governed by the laws of freedom. We have a will, we can make choices, and so therefore we can exercise those choices well, or we can exercise them badly, and we can become free through being moral people, or we can become constrained by our emotions. So human beings, certainly we have a will, we're governed by the laws of freedom. But we're also governed by the laws of nature. For instance, there's all sorts of things happening in your body that's involuntary, right? Your heart pumps blood, and your lungs cause you to breathe. There's all sorts of reflexes you have that you don't even think about, right? Your body is a physical thing, and it's governed by physical laws. And at the same time, as we'll see in a moment, there are various psychological laws that operate on our minds and affect our decision-making in ways we don't even realize. So what is unique about the human being is that the human being is sort of in both of these spheres at the same time. As one philosopher put it, Roger Scruton, he says human beings are on the edge of nature. We share some characteristics with inanimate objects and animals who Kant doesn't think have a will. We also share some characteristics with the divine. We also have this will and this capacity to follow the laws of freedom. And I think one simple way to see this idea that we at the same time are under the influence of the laws of nature and the laws of freedom is to think about some of the psychological influences on our behavior. In this passage, it describes one particular psychological study on the influences on cheating behavior. And here's what the study found. In a series of 3 experiments, a group of psychologists found that lighting could affect cheating. In one study, participants in a dimly lit room cheated more often than those in a lighter one. So think about that for a second. Your choice about whether to cheat or not, which we would say is a moral choice, can be affected by something as seemingly irrelevant and outside of your control and operating on your subconscious in ways you don't understand, as are you in a dimly lit room or a light room? And it's not only not within your control, it seems completely morally irrelevant. This is just sort of a fact about our psychology that our decision making is affected by those things. So then the question you have to ask yourself is, are we entirely determined by those things? Does it make it, if we're in a dimly lit room in combination with other factors, does that make it such that we're definitely going to cheat? That we're just sort of like the car and we're like the computer. We just follow the instructions that have been programmed into us. Well, if Kant is right, then the answer to that is no. He agrees that we are subject, our human will, our decision-making choices is subject to the laws of nature. There's all sorts of psychological laws that operate on us. Our personal history operates on us. What political, religious, social community we're born into and our upbringing, that all operates on us, all these environmental factors. So we are subject to the laws of nature. But because we have a will, and because we have freedom, and we have the ability to choose, we are also subject to moral laws. It's the case that we can resist our instincts, we can resist our passions, we can resist these environmental factors and choose to become free. And this example makes, I think, this point perfectly about the laws of freedom. If you do the wrong thing. If you cheat and the reason you did it is because you were in a dimly lit room and you couldn't resist, are you not controlled by that environmental influence? Wouldn't you be much more free as a human being, as a person, if you had resisted that and done what you know is right, despite whatever environmental influences are acting upon you? So this idea that the human will is subject to both of these laws, but that we have the ability to act in a free way, to act in a moral way, really lies at the foundation of Kant's moral thinking. So now that we have seen these points about the science of ethics, we've seen that ethics doesn't study the psychological laws that influence our behavior, but studies the moral laws that should govern our behavior and the ones that allow us to conquer our passions and desires and become free. Now that we have seen that, we should say something about, well, what are these ethical laws, what are these laws of freedom like? And of course, as I've indicated, because Kant's a moral absolutist, we should expect him to say that the laws that will make you free, again, paradoxically, are absolute commands for which there is no wiggle room, for which there is no way to get around. And I think the passage he puts this best is the following one from the preface. So here's what he says. For that there must be such is of itself clear from the common idea of duty and moral laws. Everyone must admit that a law, if it is to hold morally, as the ground of an obligation, must carry with it absolute necessity. That the command, thou shalt not lie, does not just hold for human beings only, as if other rational beings did not have to heed it. And so with all the remaining actual moral laws, hence that the ground of obligation here must not be sought in the nature of the human being or the circumstances of the world in which he is placed, but solely in concepts of pure reason. So he's saying, look, think about the idea of the moral rule that one should not lie. When you tell someone they shouldn't lie, and you mean it in a moral and ethical sense, not just a prudential sense, like, don't lie because, things won't work out for you, you'll get caught. But you mean, I'm saying there's a moral obligation not to lie. What are you telling them? Are you just telling them it's a guideline? Are you telling them, maybe on Tuesday you can tell a few lies, but don't do it the rest of the week, or maybe it depends on the circumstances? No. If we're really talking about a moral obligation, then when you're telling someone that they can't lie, you mean that they can't lie regardless of the circumstances of the world in which they find themselves. To truly become free is not just to follow the rules most of the time, but then when it's really difficult and you really don't want to follow the rules, then you'll just give in to your passions. No. That would be to not have conquered the animal side of yourself. To truly become free is to always follow the laws of freedom, to always do what is right, to always follow the moral absolutes, using reason alone, using your will to choose what is correct, and not give in to immediate inclination and immediate desire. And notice what he says about here. If we thought that a rule like you shouldn't lie, you could just choose when to follow it or not, you didn't always have to follow it, then he says you could call that a practical rule, but never a moral law. It would just be sort of like a rule of thumb, like, yeah, most of the time don't lie, but, be judicious and think about when you might need to. Well, that might be a practical rule if you want to be successful in life, maybe, or successful in business or something. But if we're talking about becoming a person, if we're talking about becoming a person who is free, a human being who lives up to their status for which we're going to see human beings deserve respect, then that would mean you can't simply give in and not follow the moral absolutes when it's not convenient for you. And for that reason, I would characterize as that for something to qualify as a moral rule or a moral obligation, it must meet two conditions. That thing, whether don't lie or don't cheat or don't steal or whatever, must be required of all rational beings, all beings with reason, all beings with a will. And it must be required in every conceivable circumstance. So we can already see here how different this is from utilitarianism. We're not calculating the consequences of our actions. We're not saying, well, what will the overall benefit be in this particular case? We're saying these are the rules. In order to become free, in order to follow these laws of freedom, they always must be followed. And for Kant, that just is what it means to say something is a moral obligation. Now, there's much more to say here. We really should be wondering, first of all, where do these moral absolutes come from? How do we know what they are? And Kant is going to address those specific points in what is to come in the next few videos that we will be examining these points. But for now, I will cut the video here. Thank you as always for listening. I'll see you next time.